Hey all, Yukine here. In this video we're going to be going over Taiyo Advent. This is one of the more difficult ones. It's a 4-star Advent. First off, we're going to be looking at the party info. The 3 recommended units are Jacqueline. She gets a increased attack bonus, 100% attack, which is a pretty significant amount. Unfortunately, I do not have her built up just yet, so I will not be using her. The only one that is not 100% required, but pretty required is Ruby. The reason being is she increases the recovery amount of your team by 100% as long as she's in the party. If you do not have a Ruby, it is perfectly viable to use a helper Ruby, though that will increase the requirements for your own team. Other recommended units are Cordelia, Ramu, and then it's pretty free from there. Another very strong character for this is Sid. He decreases all these skill cooldowns for all your team members by 1 turn as long as he's in the party. Unfortunately, when I was first starting out, when his Advent came out, I was not strong enough at that time to clear him, so I do not have him for this run. But in this case, I'm primarily going to be just running with Ruby and Ramu, which are the 2 characters that I would highly recommend. Another character that is much easier to get a hold of is Cordelia. And the reason for that, she's quite tanky for this Advent. And in this case, I'm going to be running with a Cordelia helper, as mine is not quite up there yet. I can find my team. So the team I generally run is Ramu with Ruby, Saya, Rue for additional healing and revives as a just in case, and then with a helper Cordelia. My Ramu is tanky enough to a point where as long as I have a helper Ramu or a helper Cordelia, she can solo Taiyo at the end. The runes I'm running on her are HP defense with triple HP for her first 3 subs, and then I'm running attack, multi-strike, HP recovery. For this, if you're running first out, you don't have a Rue like at 5-star like I do with quite the same stats, I would recommend maybe running as much HP recovery in the 4th and 5th slot as possible. I just generally run more attack just to do that extra bit of damage, and multi-strike for, again, chances to do more damage. But when I'm running double Ramu, she has around 23,000 health with 2,300 defense, which is more than enough to tank all of the heavy hitters in this Advent. In this case, we're going to be running with Ferb's Cordelia, which is pretty tanky, and then just putting it on auto while I go over the Advent dungeon mechanics. One of the main reasons I like to run Cordelia, she ends up speeding up the dungeon runs quite a bit, and it's mainly because of the Taiyo fight himself. The boss has a heavy nuke that deals damage to a targeted character and adjacent characters. In this case, most of the time, your tank character will be the one that is focused by the boss. So in this case, he would be targeting Cordelia and Rue, while leaving my damage units, Saya and Ruby up, which significantly increases my run speeds. But it's perfectly viable with double Ramu and a Ruby, or with your own Cordelia. And so going over the actual mechanics for the first round, Howard has a buff that cannot be removed, decreases damage taken by enemies that are taunted. His normal attack has a decent chance to taunt a single character for 1 turn. He also will periodically apply a counter strike buff to himself and a attack buff, whereby has a high chance to stun, or not stun, but charm your entire team. Not charm, but taunt, right? He has a high chance to taunt your entire team. Ruby can strip those buffs off him. Rue can do the same. So in this case, we're going to wait for him to apply that buff. Another thing that you're going to have to deal with for all 3 fights is every boss in this advent has a resolve passive, where when you kill them, they will revive with about 1/3 of their health. This significantly increases the advent dungeon duration. Generally, my runs with this team run somewhere between 15 minutes to 20 minutes. Other characters that you can use in here, Esna is a decent choice just to clear out this first round very quickly. The first boss is susceptible to Esna's mental seal buff or debuff, which will cause him to deal 50% of his health back to him in damage when he takes an action for 2 turns. And usually running that strategy, my Esna will go first, will apply mental seal, and then I'll rely on the boss either taking a action or counter striking to deal that 50% damage, kind of instantly kill him, and then hopefully he kills Esna. And then with Rue, I can revive her, refresh that 3rd skill's cooldown, and apply mental seal again. And with Esna, it generally runs about 15 seconds for this first round, which significantly speeds it up. Unfortunately, Taiyo, which is the final boss, for most of his fight, he has a water absorb shield, so he'll actually heal from water damage. So it is not recommended to run water units like Esna, unless you're going to be manually controlling them and defending on the Taiyo boss. You're perfectly fine running with water healers. If, say, you don't have like a Rue or something, you could run like Deimos or Karen. While they will heal the boss, it's nothing compared to the damage that your other characters are going to be dealing. So at this point, we're just going to run through and let him continue. One thing to note, if you do not run a tank, such as Cordelia on your team for this, the boss will tend to attack whoever is doing the most damage to them, or focus that character. In this case, it would be my Ruby, so she'll get attacked by enemy bosses quite often, especially if I do not have a Cordelia up. So next we have Ronin. The first thing he does is he uses his nuke on a character, in this case on Cordelia. It did about 1/3 of her health. She's quite tanky. It's most likely going to one-shot most characters unless they're a tank or they're built quite tanky, such as my Ramu, though he'll do about 80% of her health and damage. And the boss will follow the kind of strategy of he'll do a normal attack and then he'll buff himself up. So we'll see that buff shortly once his next turn comes up. So now he's applied 3 buffs to himself. One is a invasion buff, Next he gets a critical strike chance increase, and he gets a attack increase buff. He also has just permanently throughout this fight, or this round, decreases damage taken by all elements other than the disadvantage element. So he will only be taking decent damage from wind units. And again, he has the resolve factor where he will revive with about a third of his health after you've killed him the first time. After he buffs up, he'll do another normal attack, and then he will use his third skill. And then that process will just repeat throughout this entire round. Yeah. If you're fighting this without a Cordelia, it's highly recommended that when he has the buffs up, you would defend on your Ramus. They're after Ruby, they're the most likely to be targeted by Ronin, unless you're running another wind DPS unit. If you defend, you have a decent chance of surviving his nuke. Other things to take note of, characters that have a chance or when they hit on certain skills can remove the buff effects. They can remove those buffs that Ronin puts up. So Rue has a small chance, if she hits them, to remove the buffs. I believe she'll remove the attack buff first. And that significantly decreases the amount of damage that his nuke attack will do, and makes it a lot more tankable. Without that attack buff, or if she's able to strip at least one of those buffs off, my Ruby has a high chance of actually surviving that attack. This boss is not susceptible. Ronin is not susceptible to mental seal effects or other instant death effects. I don't remember if I mentioned that, but if you're running the rune set as a small chance to apply Looming Death, that does work on the first boss, but will not work on Taiyo or Ronin. So here we're going to just let it continue until we get to Taiyo, and we'll go over his mechanics then. Other team compositions, if your team is strong enough and you have a Cordelia built up, you could run Ruby, Ramu, Cordelia with another Wind DPS unit, and then either like a Helper Ruby or a Helper Ramu, or even a Helper Cordelia if you don't have one built up yourself. But as long as you have like a 5 Wind unit team, you can get that 60% attack bonus from your Ruby. That will significantly increase the run speed. Peppy, for instance, he runs Ruby, Kali, Sid, Ramu, and Cordelia. And he gets about 6 minutes Advent runs on full auto. But most of his units are like plus 12, plus 15 runes with almost max skilled, if not max skilled. So next we hit Taiyo. The main things we're going to be dealing with, again, for his entire first phase, he'll heal instead of taking damage to water elements. So if you're running with like Esna, at this point you're going to want to kind of manually take control, defend on her. He also, throughout the entire fight, has this boss specialty. Cannot be removed. He deals additional damage when counterattacking. It is a pretty significant amount. But throughout the fight, he'll be applying a debuff to himself that removes his chance to counterattack for the duration of that debuff. So if you have characters that are very fragile, you want to, and you don't have too many revives or anything like that, you may want to defend on those characters until that debuff is up. For the first 5 rounds, Taiyo has a buff called Pain Relief, where he takes a significantly reduced amount of damage from skill 3s. So any 3rd skills that attack him will do reduced amount of damage. After the 5 turns during the first phase, you're not going to see it again until he goes into his second and enraged phase. And then throughout the first phase, Taiyo will rotate between his first and his second skill, the first being just a single target attack. The second skill hits the target and then the adjacent target. In this case, that's most likely going to be Cordelia. So I've placed Rue here just because she's not a significant contributor towards clearing this fight quickly. And if she does die, I can always revive her with Ramu. But usually you're not going to want your main units that you're relying on to be next to the main target that he's going to be dealing damage to. And if you can help it, you'll want that main target to be on the very edge of your team, because again, it does attack adjacent allies. But because he's going to be attacking Cordelia, the only character that's also going to be taking damage is Rue in this case. Instead of, say, if I was running double Ramu, he would most likely be attacking my Ruby, so he'd be hitting Ramu, Ruby, and Saya. So we're going to let this continue. Again, without that debuff, that counterattack debuff, he has a pretty significant chance to counterattack. There he did his normal attack on Cordelia. And then he used his second skill, which, again, if you see this blue shield with kind of that arrow that bouncing off the shield, that's his counter chance decrease debuff. When he has that up, he will not be counterattacking any of your characters that attack him. Ruby is a pretty good target to be or character just in general to be fighting Taiyo with. The reason being, her passive, she has a 50% chance to heal because her cooldowns are reduced. So whenever her cooldowns are reduced, she heals 20% of her health. Because of the healing increase from running her in the party, she'll be healing 40% of her health whenever that cooldown is decreased. So it's a pretty significant chance, 50%, whenever he attacks her, that she'll just reduce all her cooldowns, which will in turn increase the amount of damage that she's doing, because she'll be able to use her second and her third skill more often. And then just relying on her passive, she'll generally stay healthy. You won't have to worry too much about healing her. The first thing you're going to really want to worry about during the phase 1 is once he drops down to about half his health, that's about 311,000, 312,000, he will use for the first time his third skill, similar to Ronin's kind of heavy nuke attack. Does a significant amount of damage, and similar to his second skill that hits 8 targets and the adjacent targets, this skill will also, his nuke skill will also hit his main target and adjacent targets. It does have piercing damage, so damage immunity shields such as Cordelia's shield will not work against that third skill. He will only use his third skill once during the first phase, so as long as he doesn't kill your revivers, you should be able to stall very easily, just normally fighting him. By the time you get him pretty low, you should have been able to revive all of your characters and gotten them back up to a healthy amount of health. So in that case, I dropped him down below that halfway point, and he nuked my Cordelia, which in turn killed my Rue. Generally, it's going to kill most characters. If you're worried that your Cordelia or your Ramu or whichever character happens to be tanking, maybe you're running with a Claude instead, because you don't have Cordelia for whatever reason, you might want to defend before his heavy nuke skill comes out. When you defend on a character, they get decreased damage taken. So here we can see I defended on Ruby, and we look in here, she has the defend buff, which decreases the amount of damage taken. Depending on just how innately tanky that character is, you may, or that being able to defend there may be what hits you over that threshold where you can survive that attack. When I was first clearing this admin dungeon, I was actually running Ruby with significant amount of counter chance. So I ran counter strike with HP and defense rune sets with a lot of HP and counter strike chance runes. And there weren't a lot of people that were running Cordelia at the time, so I was having to rely on double Ramu. And my strategy generally was defend on Ramu and Ruby. Ruby would just barely be able to survive that nuke skill, and I would kind of just bank on counter strikes, finishing Taiyo off, while using Rue and the Ramu heals where appropriate. So here we're getting pretty close to ending Taiyo's first phase. You've been running Ruby, Leafa, Rebecca, Jacqueline, and Karen. I mean, it works. Like, as long as it's working, it's fine. Most teams are going to be pretty slow in this advent, especially if you don't have like just high win DPS. Like right now, I only really have Ruby and Ramu that are dealing decent amount of damage. My Saya does a good amount of damage to Taiyo himself, but she deals significantly reduced damage to Ronin. So there's different aspects of this fight that, depending on what you're using, may go faster or slower. Again, like for instance, originally I was running with Esna instead of Saya, just because she can clear the first round within like 15 seconds if all goes according to plan. But then if I'm running on full auto after that point, she'll actually increase the admin dungeon time because she'll be healing Taiyo with her water damage. At this point, we're going to take Taiyo into his second phase. Usually what you would want to do is on any characters that are at risk of being attacked, you'll want to preemptively defend on them. But I'm going to just bring him into his second phase. Once he goes into his second phase, which is after you've killed him the first time, he'll lose his water immunity, or his water absorption shield. So he'll no longer heal from water damage. At that point, if you are running an Esna, you can just go ham and do as much damage as you possibly can. In turn, he gains the pain relief buff, where he takes decreased damage from third skills. So for instance, my Saya normally during his first phase hits him anywhere between 30,000 to 50,000 with over 60,000 in crits. If I use her third skill now, it only dealt 16,000. And the first thing he's going to do after he gets into this phase, the first time he has a turn, he will use his nuke. That's generally going to be, again, if you're running a Cordelia, it's likely he's going to target her. Or if you're running without any tanks, it's most likely going to be your highest DPS, such as Ruby. That's pretty decent, Blazed. I'll be going over some of the early game strategies after this. I'm recording this for YouTube, so. But at this point, I can just put this back on full auto. Let me control my Ramu's revive is not up yet. But essentially, if you're going to be running this on manual, you'll be wanting to defend on who's going to be taking this Taiyo's hits. In this case, it's mostly going to be Cordelia, but she is tanky enough that I can just go without defending and let it run on auto. One thing to take note, after his nuke skill, he also gains that Counter-Strike debuff and Weakness Reveal. Weakness Reveal allows your characters to have a 100% crit chance against the boss until he takes his next turn, where that will fall off. If you're not able to keep track of when he's going to use his nuke, if you're having a hard time doing that, he alternates between his first and his third skill. And you know he's going to use his nuke or his third skill whenever he no longer has those debuffs up. Is she SSR? No, Cordelia is a SR unit. So she's quite easy, or less rare than other units like Ruby. So at this point, I can put Ruby, or revive Ruby and Saya, hopefully. Preferably, I'm going to just be targeting Ruby for this. Thankfully, it did revive Saya. And we can defend here. We don't want to die to a Counter-Strike. And then just to show off the penetrating damage, we're going to use Cordelia's immunity shield, just to show that it will actually go through that. So we saw Cordelia actually did indeed take damage. She took around 70,000 or 7,000. And another effect of his third skill, it does have a small chance to apply a one-turn stun. So if you have healers that can either remove that, Rue's second skill, her heal, can remove that just by reducing that turn duration by 1. It is a 1-turn duration, and by removing that 1 duration, it will effectively remove that debuff. Rue is very good for this. If you have her, because she can apply that 2-turn status immunity buff on her second skill. And at this point, he's low enough, I can just finish him off with my Ruby's second skill. And that is how you clear Taiyo.